An attempt to, in a word, annihilate one of Zizek's more faulty pretenses through the example he himself has oft raised of the supposed misguidedness of the position of Judith Butler. So Zizek says that Butler raises as though it were something enticingly special in its significance, the notion, which according to Zizek is the most commonplace thing in the world, that there's something like I use an outside term, which isn't it's almost from Zizek's point of view, you could apply Descartes, the Cartesian subject, as radically different from everything else, radical subjectivity in this place in Butler. But that's sort of like a superimposition. But let's say just from Butler's, the way Zizek reads Butler, all he's saying is, she says that the performativity is very radical, and it includes something like, to vulgarize it, I guess, like Jean-Paul Sartre's saying that the existence comes first. We're here, and then what we are, we make this identity in some way, something like that. So and then Zizek says, well, isn't this what the whole culture is teaching us, more or less? Isn't this the most commonplace thing that we can make ourselves, and everything's radically open and so forth? But the thing that Zizek gets wrong, and then I would take from this that it in fact it invades his entire thinking with a sort of vast ignorance, is that this is only half of the picture. This is the political picture, but it's not. This is the political picture in the limited sense that Hannah Arendt is talking about in her letter to Karl Jaspers in the 50s, when she says, it's almost, I don't know which is more difficult to instill, even a soupçon or inkling of what politics is to the German, or even an inkling of what philosophy is to the American. So it's politics in this sense that it's alienated from directing oneself through Wissenschaft, or through Aristotelian philosophy understood through Thomas Hobbes, or through the tradition of Harold Laswell, and that leads up to B.F. Skinner or something like that, or Daniel Dennett, where really you have political thinking which is intimately tied in this notion of social engineering, for instance. That this political thinking is tied in with a view of what the sciences are, what motion is, what we're talking about when we make any kind of analysis which is relevant to us as being. When you have that feeble idea of politics, American politics, it's split from, there's politics and then there's this other region. In the other region you have the so-called fact. So politics is where the values are and where they activate through group affinities and parties, factions. And then you have the other side of it, which is the so-called facts. And then each party tries to garner the so-called facts, which are so well reputed because they're scientific and neutral, in order to serve their arguments that they're trying to make for their agenda and so on. What Zizek's missing is Butler is aware that there's two regions. There's the political region where a kind of existentialism is in charge, and then there's this other thing called the fact, where science is in charge, where this, science and its so-called knowledge of the objective reality is in charge. So Zizek is acting as though Butler were just in the political or existential realm of pure values or pure subjectivity, where nothing can be proved. But Butler, in her own self-understanding, is standing in what's called critical theory, which means what follows on Kant. So Kant distinguished himself from the mere dogmatist who said how it should be, how it ought to be, and on the other side, the scientific investigators of the empirical, like has set up a Hume and so on. So because the critical philosophy stands between those, then what she's saying isn't only directed towards this split, but it's an attempt to make an observation, as it were, standing perhaps somehow outside. I don't know, if you have some kind of, you start to do this fragilise, and then you bring in, the 1,000 plateaus or something, and you say, oh, binaries have to be, we can talk sort of as though there were binaries. Some surfaces are smooth, some surfaces are some other way, but they're not exactly, we're aware of what we're doing in such a way that we don't make the two terms dependent on each other. Through some fragilise, one can put away the fact-value distinction and the science politics distinction, and then try to think something critically without giving way to any ready-made views of how things are. Then you can come up with another view. So I think in this sense, we see from this sort of petty notion concerning Butler and critical theory that Zizek has something where he's not totally aware of some of the difficulties which Heidegger certainly is aware of, which Leo Strauss was aware of, and so on, which Hannah Arendt was aware of.